Let me share my screen. Okay, everything looks good? Cool, thanks guys. Hi, thank you so much for coming to this talk. If we haven't met yet in the studio or around, my name's Avery. I'm one of the artists in residence this year. And tonight I'm gonna give you a brief overview of my meandering artistic journey that's led me to where I am now, and talk more in depth about the direction my work has taken over the past year or so, and where I'd like to take it while I'm here at CAC. So a little about me. I'm originally from North Carolina in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. I come from a very creative and industrious line of women. So craft has always been a big part of my life from my early childhood onwards. All the women in my family have been makers as far back as anyone can remember on either side of my family, and they created things to take care of their families and themselves, passing the time working with their hands and then passing on their knowledge to the next generation. So on the right, there's a photo of a quilt that my great-grandmother made for my grandmother decades ago. Still lays on her bed every night. And below is the first weaving that my mom made while in college that I now have, and she's still a textile artist who inspires me every day. So currently my work revolves a lot around the history of women's work and the simultaneous comfort and pain that I find in that. I really love ornate and decorative things, work that is traditionally associated with the feminine, but I want my work to escape the confining historic standards that have been applied to women and their creative work. It is important to me that my work is bright and colorful and messy and joyful, and that it doesn't have to be beautiful in a traditional way, but that it still connects me to my family and my history. Of course, it took me a really long time to come to that understanding of what I wanted my work to look like and to be about. So this is some work from my undergrad. I went to University of North Carolina, Asheville, and I graduated in 2017 with degrees in ceramics and art history. A lot of my art history research was about the folk pottery history of North Carolina, and my work kind of mirrored that. So I was doing a lot of salt firing with local clays, which feels very different than what I'm doing now. After I graduated, I apprenticed at the Village Potters, which is an amazing education center and gallery in Asheville. This is where I started seriously teaching ceramics, and education became just as important to me as the creation of my personal work. Over these couple of years, my work developed a lot. I was doing lower firing temperatures, a lot more colors. It got a little closer to where I am now, but it was still very centered around pottery. I knew that I wanted to go to grad school to push myself conceptually and experiment with more sculpture. And I also wanted to get more credentials as an educator. So I started at SUNY New Paltz in 2019, and I graduated with my MFA this past May. And during my time there, I studied under the wonderful Brian Seabez, Anat Shifton, and Sam Mack. And they all really challenged me to put myself in a work in a way that I felt that I wasn't able to before. And I did, honestly, a lot of crazy experimenting to try and find my voice. So I thought I'd share one wacky experiment that I did. Hopefully the video works. So yeah, this is a claymation that I made, and it feels really silly and fun now, and I don't know if it's something that I'll revisit, but I still do use a lot of these shapes and colors in my work, so I think it was still influential. So as we all know, COVID hit. I took a year off of grad school, and that kind of allowed me to come back when I returned with a lot more clarity and direction in my work. So this year is really when things started to cohere for me in terms of what I wanted to say and what I was interested in. During the pandemic, I started to make pots that I was seeing in books and in paintings, because I was stuck looking at ceramics mostly on screens and on paper. And I became really frustrated by the limitations of understanding like a three-dimensional object through a two-dimensional lens. It's something that we're always doing. It's something that we're doing right now. But the like physical impact of that didn't hit me until the experience of lockdown, and realizing how like tactile our practice is. So I thought that if I pulled these images that I was seeing into space, they would kind of become mine in a way, as my brain and hands filled in what wasn't visible of the object on the page. So in this image, there's a 15th century Spanish vessel that I've always really loved, but I have no idea where it is, who it belongs to. So I have little hope of ever seeing it in person. So I really wanted to recreate it and be able to touch it. And here's another one I did. This is a vessel that was cropped on the edge of one of my favorite Matisse paintings, that I've always felt kind of bad for. It's cut off, and I wanted to bring it into full being and kind of have it there to play with. So when I got back to grad school, I continued with this like obsessive act of translations through dimensions, and it became a means of inserting myself forcefully into a canon art history timeline, by taking forms from famous paintings and respected museum collections and reworking them over and over. They started to become like sillier and stranger and more me, and I was able to like overlay my own desires over these classical forms. So I started working in this iterative process, where I would draw a vessel that I wanted to have. I would make that drawing out of clay, then I would draw what I had just made, then I would make that drawing, et cetera, until I had an object that was so divorced from its original context that it felt like it was truly mine, but that I was still a part of this larger timeline. So here, this is at the bottom of the screen, the purple and green vessel is that Matisse pot that I glazed. On the right is a blind contour drawing that I did of that vessel. And then back in the photo on the left, that pot with the squiggles is the reinterpretation of that drawing. So the pattern and decoration have kind of become lifted off the form. They've become part of the sculptural element, which will come into play later. So it was this iterative line of thought that I followed for the series that I created for the CAC New Paltz show, which is where I met a lot of you for the first time. I started with a vessel from a Mary Cassatt painting. This one I'll skip back and forth a little bit. So this is Mary Cassatt's Woman Bathing from 1890. And she's a painter that's notoriously associated with the Impressionist movement, but she's always been relegated, or she was relegated to painting domestic scenes because she was a woman in the domestic sphere. And the gentleness and care with which she painted her limited world has always struck me. But I also wanted to pull something out of that world and let it live on its own outside of the like traditionally feminine restrictions of beauty and grace. So these three pots here are reworkings of each other. They're inspired by that jug in the painting. And I've also pulled some of the patterning and coloring from the original painting and played with how those sit on the form and on the paper, and they kind of blend together to kind of play back and forth off of each other and create something new. So another huge source of inspiration for me, a few months before that show happened, I went to a show at the Bard campus entitled With Pleasure, Pattern and Decoration in American Art from 1972 to 1985. I initially went because I knew that there were a few Betty Woodman pieces in the show who I have always adored. But the show gave me a really intense and unexpected sense of belonging, as I realized that there was this movement of people who had decades earlier really put words towards what I had felt unable to explain emotionally in my work for so long. This group embraced imagery and techniques traditionally typically associated with the decorative arts. So a majority of their sources came from far outside the traditional art world canon. They were looking at quilts, embroidery samples, applique, ceramic tile, basket weaving. And so the pattern and decoration artists were really loudly and proudly feminists. They were championing women's work as an important part of art history. And I really felt like I saw my mother and grandmother and great-grandmother in so much of the work and the writing about the show, which felt really special to me. I was especially struck by a quote from the curator Anna Katz, who explained that artists who embraced pattern as part of this movement, the pattern and decoration movement, really reveled in its superficiality. They understood pattern as a, quote, promiscuous thing that is loyal to no medium or material and could thus be proliferated infinitely across anything. So it would infect every surface that it touched. And I really felt a power in this possibility. The artists in this movement released decoration from its domestic confinement and really let it out into the world to infect previously white-walled, hallowed grounds of really like masculine, clean, minimal art that was popular at the time. And they really brought this like exuberance of ornamentation to the center stage of the art world. And this made me really think about the process that I had fallen into of pulling forms from two-dimensional spaces and made me want to push patterns into three-dimensional spaces as well. So all of the women in my family have been textile artists in some way or another, seamstresses, quilters, knitters, etc. And I've always been inspired by their vibrant use of pattern and color, but I felt that I was never able to like properly translate it onto a ceramic surface. And so I wanted to push these patterns into a sculptural space and make them louder and unavoidable. And so all of this research from this movement and my previous works really led me to the body of work that became my final thesis show in graduate school. So the daisy that you're looking at right now is one of the first, I feel, successful experiments I had in realizing that concept. It's an element from a larger botanical pattern. I looked at a lot of wallpapers and Victorian textiles for these. And I expanded that element of the pattern in size, and I allowed it to stand on its own. I ended up making 3 of these for my graduate thesis show. Here they are right now. My thesis show is entitled Bloom. The fronts are colored in like a coloring book. So big flat swaths of color. The object looks like what it is, but the backs are glazed with a maiolica, and so I painted onto them, kind of loosely imitating the patterns that the flowers grew from. So here's a shot of my entire thesis installation, and it continued that idea of pattern growth. My sculptures are situated in kind of a suggestion of a domestic space. So the 2 end tables on the left and the lower coffee table on the right are just bare plywood. And they're imitating the profile lines of the furniture that might fill in a very traditionally like overly ornamented room. There's wallpaper hanging behind the vessels on the left. I designed it and printed it on a translucent mylar, which allowed light to shine through as you walked around the display. And so these suggestions of a domestic space, domestic interior, pointed towards my visual references, but maintained a sense of airiness and open space instead of feeling enclosed. So here's some more images from that. I've been thinking more recently of these vessels as self-portraits. They're more self-portraits than the flowers are. I've been really stuck on the forms of pitchers and goblets kind of used in ritual ceremonies for these past few years, because very commonly vessels are understood as reflections of the body. And many vessels are compared to the female form, and sometimes that ends up coming across in like a very fetishizing way. But also I feel that pitchers and goblets represent these really nurturing and caring aspects of femininity. They imply a connection to and care for a larger community in their serving capabilities. And something that has become a recurring theme in my work is figuring out what I want to keep and what I want to push away of what has been kind of assigned to me in my feminine form. These values of community care and nurturing are something that I want to emphasize and value and keep in my life and in my work. So a couple more close-ups. These vessels were also experiments in how to express a different stage of pattern growth. And then I wanted to feel like kind of the beginning stage of watching the patterns start to lift off of the vessel. So these are all low fire terracotta. These are again Maiolica glazed. And this one is referencing this trend of a pink French Sèvres porcelain, but mine's a little goofier than this very like dainty, elevated creation here on the right. The goblet similarly has a lot of historic references. I was looking at little Staffordshire figurines, which were again very popular in the Victorian era. And I've just been enchanted with how odd they are. They feel like grown-up dolls, and they also have this very like flattened botanical pedestals that they're often placed on. So those have been a big inspiration in my work for a while. So also strewn throughout the installation were these little doodads, which is how I refer to them. They're little elements of my drawings and patterns that are brought to life and kind of sent out to like explore the space. They serve as a connection between the separate sculptures in the show and give a sense of movement. They bridge the connection between the flat patterns and drawings and the fully realized ceramic forms. Yeah, so that's my thesis show. I finished all that up in May. And now I'm here at CAC, which is great. I've really been enjoying continuing my journey as an educator, attempting to translate some of the processes that I've developed over the past few years into lessons that will encourage my students to express themselves and not to be afraid to experiment and do weird things, because you never know what might end up happening. Here's a little bit of what I've been working on in the short time that I've been here. On the left is a demo from my surface design class. On the right is a commissioned box that I just finished. I've been wanting to revisit pots for a while and really connect my love of surface and pattern back into a form that's actually like accessible and touchable. So I've also made some mugs for the gallery. I've been having a lot of fun with newsprint transfers and how that process allows me to imitate some like wallpaper patterns and textures. So just figuring out how to tie pots into my overall research process and making cycle. I'm also thinking about what I want to do for my final show. I'm working through some sculptural ideas for that. Moving forward, I want to focus less on these like externalized impressions and interpretations of femininity that I've been concerned with, especially this like external understanding of and appreciation of beauty. And I'm interested in turning more inwards, focusing on my relationship to myself within myself. So like how I would grapple with feminine expectations if I was the only one watching. So kind of like redefining that for myself. So I'm working on this gate right now. This is just a maquette for a larger piece. I've been thinking about decoration as a protective measure, a shield that we put on our individual private spaces that either enhance or hide internal senses of identity. The gate's kind of a representation of this act of, it kind of acts in two ways, as a protection method or a welcoming method. And I've got some little decorative bits I'm excited to glaze, to play with. And I'm excited to keep working on things in general and maybe have a little garden space for the show. Thank you so much for listening. If you want to contact me or view more pictures of my work, you can visit my website, you can email me, you can check out my Instagram for more updates. And this is a picture of me and my mom at my thesis show when she had a boot on. So thank you all so much for listening. I appreciate it. And here we go.
Thank you so much, Avery. That was wonderful. I'm going to invite Jon to go ahead and share. Thank you, Jon.
All right, 1 second. I thought I had it opened already. It looks like All right, everybody can hear me? Awesome.
Yes, we're good. Thank you.
Thanks, Regina. All right, I'm Jon Green. My name's Jon Green. I just moved here from Montana. Thank you to Clay Art Center for hosting me for this year, and to my fellow residents for joining me in this wonderful Zoom talk. I'm a Mexican-American artist. I'm a second-generation Mexican-American. Have a pretty large family, and oftentimes when I introduce myself to people, people are surprised to hear that. So sometimes I will introduce myself as Juan Verde. My start in ceramics was sort of one of luck, I guess. I was going to nursing school and had moved to Missoula, Montana, where the University of Montana is located, with Julia Galloway, who some of you may have recognized around the studio. In our boneyard up in the main classroom, there's a few of her pictures up there, and Trey Hill. I had just dropped out of nursing school, was kind of trying to figure out what I was doing next with my life, and ended up finding my way into the ceramics program, and what was also just a really great art program at the University of Montana. I'm starting off with what is my first solo show. This is the fall of my senior year at the university in Missoula. At this point, I was working a lot with sculptural elements, mixed media. There's a lot of ceramic. A lot of the primary elements in this show are ceramic based, but a lot of it is kind of experimenting with different materials that use a lot of labor, or like upholstery, paper pulp. And I wasn't yet making work about my own Mexican-American identity. This work was really using function and utility to abstract and create metaphor for just different things I would see, or like personal narratives. But I'm showing it kind of vaguely in terms of like, I really want you guys to pay attention to like the tactile elements, the bright contrasting colors, because I felt like this is sort of a precursor to what my work is now. And I kind of carried a lot of that into my BFA thesis. So lawn culture, kind of just using like very basic elements, this idea of implied movement to connote like lawns and monocultured lawns, to make up this idea of what is like a really big symbol in the American dream. A lot of my work revolves around this absurd nature of the American dream. Using similar building methods, these are both coil built, but using different surfaces to connote like kind of a polarization in this kind of shepherd hook, and the way they're mounted as well. A rocking table, kind of a metaphor for rocky situations or rocky conversations that could be held at the dinner table. This is something that was like very personal to me too, just being in like a large Mexican-American family. There's a lot of different political opinions. I feel like that holds true in a lot of immigrant families as well. Using upholstery, a material of labor, how we could connote gender onto objects, or imbue gender onto objects using color, like pink and blue. Towel rack, this idea that like this elongated, almost 4 foot tall towel rack, that's really absurd in its height, can also be kind of this idea of like laying out these socks at the end of the day. This idea for me of like hanging up your masculinity at the end of the day using these like soccer socks, if you will. And then again, the contrasting color and the tactile surface. Thing one, this was something that was my way of criticizing. A lot of my work oftentimes is a criticism of, or not a criticism, but like a kind of a joke on art history for artists. So Marcel Duchamp, some of you may know, is the first artist to use the idea of the found object, or the ready-made. So the idea of like introducing a bicycle wheel into the gallery as reinforcing the idea that the idea from the artist is more important than the labor itself. So my response to that was, you know, covering this object in an upholstered fabric. Being in a Mexican American family, I was always around a lot of upholsterers. My mom and my dad, I grew up around a lot of homemaking. And this idea of upholstery kind of fit into my identity as a Mexican American, even though I didn't really know it at the time. I felt like this work, it had an artist statement, and basically I was trying to imbue the sense on this importance of objects and making objects and how they're made and reflecting on that, but not necessarily knowing that that also fit into my own Mexican American identity. So while I was working on this show, and after I set it up, about 3 or 4 weeks later, my abuelita passed away. And this was sort of a game changer in my work, in that my grandma was always around when I was younger. She helped raise me. My mom was single at the time. And so my grandma spoke Spanish to me while I was also learning English. And so I was fluent in Spanish when I was younger, but as I moved away from Southern California and further away from my grandma and my family, I slowly lost that ability to speak the language fluently. When I lost that access point, I guess, into what is that immigrant background, my grandma grew up in Mexico City, immigrated to San Diego in the 60s. And the reason I included these two photos, this is my grandma in the center here, surrounded by all of her children. And all the clothes that they're wearing, they were all sewn by her. She was a seamstress. And, you know, she, not only did she do that for her work, but she had to do it for this large family to, you know, be able to pay the bills and get all the kids to church on time. And those things. And she sewed this beautiful wedding dress as well. And I was kind of reflecting on all these images right after I set up this past show, and I was looking at these bright images, or these bright contrasting colors and Chicano artwork, and kind of how it reflected back onto my own identity as a Mexican American. Yolanda Lopez, I had the opportunity to see some of this work in person about 1.5 years ago at UCSD. The detail and the pastels are really breathtaking. But I also started paying attention to all these patterns and the symbolism of the seamstress and the matriarchal family. The icon of Lady Guadalupe, or the Virgin Mary, was one that was not necessarily popular until the colonization of Latin America in the Americas, because of the past religion of the indigenous people. They were very matriarchal. There was all this influence of European fashion books when Latin America was colonized in the 15th, 16th century. There was this huge influx of European influence of like ornate patterning, fashions from France and Spain. But there was also this like huge craft culture and all these craftspeople in the Americas that had this beautiful patterning themselves and knew how to work with their hands, and they were really good with textiles. So these two patterns, these are mestizo prints commissioned by the church. And I really want you guys to pay attention to just like all the ornate details. The figures are not necessarily like academically, like they don't have the best shadowing. But the colors and the contrasting colors and the amount of ornament, like the patterning is, I feel like, is very indicative of what the Americas means, and kind of this influx of cultures. All right, so the spring after my previous show, I really focused on the patterning and the ornamental elements that you saw in those last slides. Those last slides were done by mestizo artists, which means that they're both of indigenous descent and of European descent. As a Mexican American, I'm in this space where I'm both the colonized and the colonizer in terms of my heritage and my background. And so those are kinds of things I'm trying to talk about with this work. This thesis work was Still kind of like playing with that idea of function and utility, but trying to highlight like the finials and the like turned wheel aspects of this coffee table and the turned wheel aspects of like this finial that this thing hangs on, or you know, things like that. So Ramos de Flores Regalado is you know, a kind of a throwback to my stepfather, who's a commercial fisherman, and I overlaid these patterns from these mestizo prints onto this surface of this form that really I didn't really know what the relation was between myself and the Mexican American identity. Some more patterning. And after this thesis work, Niño Azul, the idea of blue boy, or the idea of this next slide shows, this is a very Eurocentric idea, the idea that blue and pink can imbue gender. And Monique, or La Monique, is Pinky. So after that work, I had a great opportunity to go to Red Lodge Clay Center in South Central Montana. So I moved, you know, about 6 hours east towards Red Lodge, and really had a wonderful time there. When I got there, I wasn't really expecting to be given all that time and space right after graduation. So I was really fortunate to have the time to kind of slow myself down and really focus on making these objects a little bit more well crafted, spending time to slow down on the pattern and think about how the pattern and the forms matched up, or how they were unique to my identity as a Mexican American. And then things really slowed down during the pandemic. These aren't necessarily in chronological order, but they really slowed down in Red Lodge because the pandemic hit like 7 months later. And I, again, was very fortunate to be in a place that wasn't necessarily incredibly impacted by that. So I just had more time and space to work. So Batallero de Mario, the Mario Deschamps, sorry, it's kind of hard to run back and forth between those. Is this, again, this idea of Marcel Duchamp's ready-made, the bottle rack, and giving it this kind of life, making it by hand and giving it this labor, but also playing with this idea of turning the Eurocentric, you know, art history, or taking that canon, that Eurocentric canon, trying to relate it to my own Mexican American identity. So Iniciación de Cortez, sorry, I gotta move the thing in here, was a wall hanging using this kind of like taco tray type platter to discuss the story of La Malinche, who was a Mayan interpreter who you know, essentially helped Cortez take over and conquer Mexico City. So something that people, I don't feel like, realize is that Mexico City and Latin America was not easily colonized. One of the reasons it was colonized eventually by Cortez and the other conquistadors was many of the indigenous nations were at war, and there was famine and there was illness, in part because of the colonizers introducing new disease. But La Malinche was an interpreter for Cortez, who helped him kind of infiltrate Mexico City. Mexico City was already a city on a lake with a natural defense system and a centralized city planning that the conquistadors could not easily get to. So La Malinche helped with this. But I'm kind of combining both this patterning, this kind of feathering patterning that I've seen in a lot of the other prints that I've been looking at, as also as a way to relate to this feather that La Malinche wore. And then again, this zigzag that she is also donning on her tunic. And then the Nike Cortez, which I'm not saying that this is something that comes from that feather, but they have a striking resemblance. But what I do think is interesting is the zigzag pattern on the soles of the Cortez and the name Nike Cortez, which is also a shoe that has been affiliated with gangs, and is, because of that, is like not allowed in certain environments because of its gang affiliation. How do I? All right, so again, details of that, the pattern and the glaze here from the dress she's wearing, and then the feather. Todos los pomos. This was a real combination of a lot of different patterns that I was using, trying to make them a cohesive image. Kind of again playing with the idea of furniture with these knobs and these finials. Dissecting this pattern that I saw, this Patrón de Planta Azul, is basically just this blue plant pattern that I saw repeating on this archangel print from before, and kind of trying to imbue it or take it into this, from this 2D pattern into this 3-dimensional pattern, while also giving it kind of a pattern of my own. Mexican Republic, playing with the Mexican flag, using the kind of the marigold coloring to symbolize the yellow shield or the gold shield and the trident of the Mexican flag, while also by dissecting it into 3 squares similar to the flag. And then each of these patterns is pulled from different Latin American artwork from 15th, 16th century. So this one's a little bit more European, and it's floral patterning. This from the center here was actually a pattern that was used to symbolize baskets and different baskets in a few of the prints that I was seeing. And then the red one on the right here was pulled from a indigenous tunic. And then the wings are to again symbolize the archangels from the prints that I showed earlier in the PowerPoint. This one I kind of just refer to as my Abuelita block. This is one of my favorite pieces that I've made the last couple of years. One of my favorite memories, or one of my biggest memories of my grandma younger, is she had hair curlers in her hair a lot. And I imbued the cinder block with the shawl, the pattern from the shawl of the Lady Guadalupe, to again symbolize the matriarch of my family, and kind of recreate that memory for me. I also really love the cinder block. It's something that I used a lot in undergrad prior to the my last couple of years in school, and it was always just an easy symbol for me to go back to. I've been asked a lot why I use a cinder block, and I've given a lot of different answers as to why, because it's kind of changed over the years. But it's primarily a a symbol for not only my own masculinity, but this idea of building walls, especially during the 2016 election, and how we talk about building walls or communicating with people. And the cinder block is an interesting building material because it has this negative space that doesn't necessarily connote wall, it connotes more window to me. It's also a symbol for, yeah, never mind. I could go on and on. If you want to talk about cinder blocks, let's chat. Anyway, thank you guys so much. Thanks Clay Art Center. Thanks my fellow residents for supporting me through the last few months. And yeah, I'm looking forward to working in New York, looking forward to working in Portchester, and working on my Spanish. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you so much, John. That was great. And now we're going to hear from Jess Levin, our Westchester Community Foundation Fellow. Thank you, Jess.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen. All right, how's this looking?
Looks
Good.
great. Thank you.
All right. Hello, my name is Jess, and I make art about my experience as a queer individual and how I like to translate that into a very whimsical, childlike, imaginary world. I'm going to talk about works from the past 2 years that I feel got me to the point where I am today. My experiences that have inspired these pieces, some of my interests and inspirations and things such as. So to start off, I was born in and grew up in Westchester. I hold a BFA of sculpture that I received earlier this year from SUNY Purchase. I started as a graphic design major, and I took a ceramic sculpture class on a whim my second semester, and I decided that I needed to keep doing this, which eventually led me to change my major completely to sculpture, and I've been loving it ever since. I took 2 ceramics classes in undergrad. I was a teaching assistant for a ceramics class, and most of my body of work was ceramics and continues to be ceramics. But I'm not going to start with ceramics. I'm actually going to start with a video that I'm going to let play while I talk about it. All right, so this is Hospital Girl. And Hospital Girl came about during 2020, during the pandemic, as I was figuring out how to continue my practice from home. I wanted to dip my toes into video making in very collage-like styles, so I created this life-size version of me as a child and gave her an environment with these ceramic pieces that I had made. So when I was 3, I was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis. People are more familiar with Crohn's, which is the sister illness. And this piece is a representation of my experiences existing in a hospital at such a young age and how we can experience trauma and not understand it until much later in life. I feel like all of my pieces teach me things, and this one taught me that it's okay to make art about myself. I really enjoyed making this art in, let me get this to go to the next slide. I really enjoyed making the doll in a very ragtag way. So I decided to continue that with Boxer Boy, who was much smaller. And he also starred in a few videos with themes of self-awareness, body dysmorphia, and puberty. I made him out of the first pair of boxers that a trans friend of mine gifted me, and they didn't fit, so I decided to make them into a doll. And Boxer Boy has sat with me in whatever studio that I have been in. And I really find doll making beautiful, especially handmade ball jointed dolls. I was inspired by those to see how I could give my doll personality through posing. And each doll I make has a wire skeleton for max bendability. So DIY top surgery was one of those ideas that came to me when I was laying awake at night, stressing about a show coming up. I was finally starting to understand that my feelings about my body and myself weren't things that cisgendered people typically feel, but calling myself trans was still very scary to say out loud, so I spoke it through my pieces instead. I'm sure many people who were raised as and socialized as girls and women can relate to people saying things about your body, unsolicited comments about your body. And everybody told me that I should feel lucky and proud that I was blessed with such a nice chest, which just made me feel guilty because from the age of 12, I always told myself that I was gonna get a breast reduction. Every time I saw myself naked in the shower, caught a glimpse in the mirror when I was changing, that same thought would run through my head. You know, I will get rid of them. But the anxiety of people being disappointed was always there as well, which led me to keeping these feelings to myself. And as I started to question my gender identity in college, these thoughts never left, and it started to make sense. You know, like I'm feeling this way about my body because it's not looking how it's supposed to look. Or, you know, it doesn't make sense. And how easy would it be if I could just cut off the parts that I don't like, which is a little morbid, but not everyone can afford a very invasive $9,000 surgery. So I made it happen, but I made it happen in a doll instead of myself. So with this doll, I wanted to incorporate the ceramic pieces into the doll directly more. So I made arms and feet out of clay, and I poked little holes in them to string them attached to the doll when I was hand sewing the doll together. And I glued the face on. After the show that these few dolls were featured in, I decided that I wanted to start experimenting with my method of making again. I was exploring more ceramic artists that did things similar to how I could see myself doing things. Kathy Rittenberg is one. She makes these gorgeous large-scale pieces that feature animals and humans and fauna existing together. I was also able to see how much I could use texture to add more to a piece. It was at this point that I found the confidence to create my depictions of myself in full ceramics with only some hints of fabrics. I started using coil building as my main method of building up. So imagination is an essential part of any child, and playing pretend as a child is a gateway into self-exploration. When I was a child, all of my imaginary friends were boys, and whenever I would play pretend with my classmates, I always took on the role of a boy as well. And I wasn't sure why, but it felt right not to conform to the expectation that I would play as a girl, because that's what everybody thought. So my piece Marvin encapsulates the imagination of a child by giving life to these comfort items like stuffed animals and matching pajama sets. All of my art pieces feel like my children. They're self-portraits. I consider them all self-portraits, and they're extensions of myself. I wish I could have lived the childhood that Marvin depicts, and despite entering adulthood, I am allowed to enjoy dinosaur pajamas and stuffed animals, and I do, but the innocence and the ignorance of being a child is gone. I consider Marvin a pivotal moment in finding my voice as an artist and experimenting with textures and shapes by carving into the clay and not worrying about how clean and neat the lines are gives the piece a playful atmosphere similar to the scribbles of a child's drawing. In these pieces, I utilize a cartoonish style of sculpting to add a surface level of cuteness to draw the viewer in while holding a deeper and sometimes darker meaning within the context of the art itself. This piece, untitled Give Me a Name, encompasses the feeling of wanting to recognize yourself, but being overcome with confusion, anxiety, a feeling that's often very hard to put into words. The queer journey is one of all of these, until finally coming to a point where you could recognize that all the uncertainty was worth it. It's really scary, but it's really beautiful as well. And adolescence is a crazy time because we absorb so many things around us, and we have to use these things and fight through some of these things to figure out who we are. And this brings me to my most recent pieces, Leo and Thomas. These are the pieces most similar to the work that I'm creating now and the direction that I am hoping to move forward here at the Clay Art Center. So this is Leo, and with these pieces, I have started to use folktale imagery to push the cute and playful aspects of my work even further, entering a new era of gender abstraction through flora and fauna. So the hare is historically a symbol of rebirth and is often depicted alongside women. In paganism, the hare is honored during the springtime as a symbol of fertility. In Egyptian myth, the hare is seen as an androgynous creature, representing the moon as it waxes, which represents the feminine, and wanes, which represents the masculine. A child playing outside doesn't really think about themselves as masculine or feminine. They don't really know the complexity of their identity yet. They haven't started exploring it. And my piece, Leo, here captures the quiet moment between just existing as a child and starting to think a little bit harder about yourself. These are the moments I wish I cherished when I was younger, where girl and boy are just empty words that don't really have a meaning. Exploration of the self is, again, a beautiful thing, but being able to sit in that blissful ignorance is wonderful as well. Using the image of the hare, the bunny pushes this childhood innocence narrative in my work. Leo is performing the very relatable task of looking for bugs under rocks and showing them off to the viewer. And this is also seen in my piece, Thomas, where I use the personification of a deer to tell a similar story. This piece shows similar thoughts, but from an older perspective. The deer is a sign of intuition and sensitivity. He encompasses the feeling of wanting to hold yourself and be kind to yourself. Deer are very gentle creatures, always aware of their surroundings, but in turn, the stag is a symbol of power and maturity. And giving my deer budding antlers pushes the narrative that he's starting to become confident in his identity. Although he sits in a way where he's protecting himself and keeping himself from getting hurt, he looks upwards towards the future. There will always be dark moments in the journey of the self, and with these pieces, I want to capture the light ones. And these two pieces were featured in my thesis exhibition in May, titled Growth and Confinement. As I'm moving forward in this direction, I'm very inspired by illustrative work that features animals, specifically woodland creatures, being personified in a very cozy and homey way. Illustration is an important part of my process as well. I like to develop these characters that I create, these representations of different parts of myself. Everything from color to clothing design to specific textures in the clothing are highly considered, as well as the activity that these characters are performing and their personalities and things such as. Comfort is a vital piece in my work, and here are some images I pulled from some artists that I like. And as you can see, I'm a big fan of animals acting like people. And here are some things that I've been working on since I've been here. And that's all I got. Thank you for listening. And I have my socials, my Instagram page, and my email. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much, Jess. That was wonderful. It was. Thank you all so much for your presentations. They were really fabulous. Thanks to everyone for attending tonight. We really appreciate you spending an evening with us. Good night to everybody.